So welcome everyone. This is the last of our three shiurim on All You Need Is Love, looking at the idea of ahavat chinam, unconditional love, as a key lesson that we're trying to take in these weeks before Tisha B'Av. The temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred, and Rav Kook famously says that it will be rebuilt through unconditional love. And we've been exploring this idea through different lenses. Our first year, we looked at the mitzvah v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And what we talked about specifically is the idea that we should love them not because they're like us, which again, that's the way most love is. We love the things that are like us, but rather v'ahavta l'recha kamocha is about loving those that may be like us but are ultimately different from us, and loving them unconditionally. Because if they're different, it means we don't necessarily get something so much out of it. In the second shiur, we looked at Franz Rosenzweig's philosophy of translation and dialogue, and how it's all about preserving the otherness of the other, right? The differences of the other, so that when we love them again, not just the parts of them that are easy for us, but also the parts that are difficult. We try to make a space for that. Other people write or speak, and the assumption is that we don't always know exactly what they mean, and we have to hold that orientation if we really want to have a real relationship with them. Because as I said, to love someone means loving them with their differences and knowing how to preserve those differences within the context of the relationship. And in this third and final shiur, we'll be looking at the idea of love as hospitality, or what we call traditionally hachnasat orchim. And we're going to be looking at this as a primary expression of what it means to love another person. So why exactly hospitality as an expression of love? And I think this is an important point. And because again, we may think of other acts as representing what love is all about, but hospitality most fundamentally is about the ability to make a space in one's life for another person. It means making a space for them in the most intimate parts of our lives, the parts we often see exclusively as our own. And hospitality is what happens in our closest relationships. That's at least my claim. Because if you think about the ones who are closest to us, the ones we love, right? We allow those we love into the intimacy of our lives, right? The private domain, our homes, like this is what we call our own. And nevertheless, we find ways to let people into them, right? And perhaps the best examples of this are our spouses and our children, right? We don't typically think of like our spouses or our children as being acts of hospitality, but when you think about it, it's kind of interesting. When we get married, we make a space for our spouse as we build a life together with them, right? You make a space for them in the home that you're building together. To be able to make a space for them requires a lot of hospitality. When you first start living with someone that you love, you really have to learn how to accommodate each other and make sure that you don't take over the space, that there's room for them. To build a home with someone is to engage in the very essence of hospitality. And so too, when our children are born, we have to make a space for them within our home too, right? Every child that comes into the home, right, there's suddenly a new person, a new human being that you have to find a way to incorporate, to include, and to make part of the family. And I think we know, even from just those experiences, our spouses and our children, that hospitality, even with those that we love, is not easy. And one might assume that it's obvious and natural to open our homes to our spouses and our children, but I think we all know that it's not simple, it's complicated. So I want to emphasize the connection between love and hospitality a bit more. And like I said, why this is such a quintessential act of love, particularly from a Jewish perspective, right? We actually have an expression in Hebrew for love in action. What does it mean to translate love into action? And the word or the expression is gimilut chasadim, often translated as acts of loving kindness. And if you were to ask most people, what are the most prominent examples of gimilut chasadim that we have, they probably actually wouldn't say to you hospitality. What they would probably suggest is tzedakah, right? When we typically think of acts of chesed, acts of loving kindness, we think of tzedakah. But I want to argue that hachnasat orchim, hospitality, is actually a much greater act of love than tzedakah. And in fact, this isn't even my argument. It's an argument made by Rav Soloveitchik. And he notes, I'll pull the quote up here, he notes about when it comes to the Avot, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, It's Avraham who's distinguished for his chesed, for his acts of loving kindness. God actually calls Avraham Ohavi. Right? Avraham is the one who loves God. Avraham is all about love. And again, the act of chesed, the act of love that distinguishes Avraham is the act of hospitality. Right? We know the famous incident of where right after Brit Milah, right after he gets the mitzvah of circumcision, Avraham is waiting in his tent, and he sees the travelers, and he brings them in, and he shows this tremendous hospitality to them. And we'll be looking at that a little bit later. But that's the primary act of chesed that Avraham embodies. We actually don't see Avraham give tzedakah in the classic sense. We don't see Avraham running around helping, throwing money to help poor people. Right? Avraham is distinguished by his hachnasat orchim, and that's significant for Rav Soloveitchik because hachnasat orchim requires a much greater level of engagement and involvement and ultimately sacrifice than tzedakah. Here's what the Rav says, and I just like this because it's so true. And until I read it, I don't think it even had occurred to me just how hachnasat orchim is really just an elevated level of chesed, of love. So he says that these are his essays that were published posthumously on Avraham. He says, yet hachnasat orchim differs from tzedakah or material help to others in a crucial way. When one gives tzedakah, it demonstrates sympathy, but not a philosophy of human equality. Hachnasat orchim, however, demonstrates full equality, the fact that every being has his own dignity and is just as important as any other. It is much easier to give someone money and send him away than to invite him under your own roof. If I invite him in, that means no matter what his station in life, I am treating him with respect as an equal. So Soloveitchik here makes, I would say, two pretty interesting points about hospitality and how it differs from tzedakah. Number one, hospitality demonstrates equality between the host and the guest. Right? It's an act that sort of levels the two sides and kind of brings them together. If the guest comes into your home and eats at your Shabbat dinner table with you and your family, it makes a profound statement that they're really not that different from you. Right? They come into your home where you live. They sit at the same table that you sit at with your family, and they eat the same food that you're eating. Tzedakah, on the other hand, often implies a hierarchy, a power differential between the giver and the receiver. Right, the giver has the power, and the receiver doesn't. And whatever kind of momentary interaction they have, it's fleeting. Right, and ultimately, you give them the money, and you kind of keep them at arm's length. Right, you don't really have to engage them in a serious way. Again, hospitality is really different because it requires a much greater sacrifice than tzedakah. It requires you to open your home, your private domain to them. And when you invite someone into your home, it requires you to make yourself vulnerable to them in a way that is really hard, right? In a way that tzedakah doesn't. And I think these two factors, the equality that hospitality brings about and the sacrifice that involved, really makes it a much higher and elevated form of chesed and ultimately of love. And it's also those reasons that make hospitality both hard, but also such a profound and potentially transformative act at the end of the day. And as I said, it's hard enough in the people who are closest to us, but again, when we're able to do it with people who are more distant than us, I think something very special can and does happen. So to better grasp what's at stake with hospitality, I want us to look at some excerpts from an essay by Rav Shagar. Rav Shagar, you know this, you've heard me probably teach him in one form or another. Rav Shagar is, in my opinion, a very, very important religious Zionist thinker. He passed away about 15 years ago. He was a founder of Yeshivat Siach Yitzchak in Efrat. He headed a whole bunch of institutions and just a profound, creative, deep religious thinker who was committed to Torah, halacha, Zionism, but engaged the broadest reaches of postmodern thought and really tried to address the most central and difficult issues that religious Zionism, modern Orthodoxy face. And in this particular essay, he explores hospitality as a very central religious act, a very central mitzvah. And the way he develops his thinking around hospitality is by developing two approaches to holiness. And he ultimately sees each approach to holiness as reflecting a different orientation to hachnasat orchim, to hospitality. So the first type of holiness Rav Shagar talks about is actually a kind of holiness that we're not so comfortable with. It's the kind of holiness that's difficult for us because it's a holiness that is ultimately terrible and awe-inspiring. Right? It's the holiness of encountering an otherness or encountering transcendence, God's transcendence, and being terrified by the experience. If this idea doesn't quite resonate with us, we don't really have to look too much farther than the Torah. Right? This kind of holiness, of otherness, of transcendence, of awe, of fear, of discomfort, this is the holiness of Har Sinai, where the Jewish people hear God speak to them. God reveals God's self in this profound moment of revelation, but it's so overwhelming to the people that they tell Moshe that it's too much for us, right? Tell God to stop talking. We don't want to hear anymore because we'll die, right? That's one type of holiness, and it's a difficult type of holiness, that sense of awe, transcendence, beyond, scary, strange, difficult, different. The other type of holiness that Rav Shagar identifies is also rooted in Chumash, but it's the kind of holiness that we're much more comfortable with. It's a holiness of goodness and joy and fullness, in a sense that our cup overflows. It's the kind of holiness where we feel that we experience God's presence. And again, instead of making us feel terrified, it offers us comfort and warmth, and gives us this feeling that we have everything that we need in our life, and that we couldn't want more. And for Rav Shagar, both of these types of holiness, as I said, are found in the Torah, and where he finds them reflected, interestingly enough, before we even get to hospitality, are in two mitzvot that are similar but also very different, and that is the mitzvah of Shabbat candles and the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles. The mitzvah of Shabbat candles reflects the holiness of, again, comfort and warmth and connection and joy, and the mitzvah of Hanukkah candles represents that holiness of, again, of awe, of distance, of strangeness, of difference. And I'll flesh out in a minute how he develops those ideas, and then we'll see how it connects to hospitality. So here's how Rav Shagar opens. He says, talk again in this essay, it's an essay from Hanukkah, this particular section titled Two Holies. This echoes a split found in the Bible where the holy sometimes appears as the awful and terrifying mysterium tremendum, right? There's one type of holiness, which again is the scary kind, the kind of encountering something so different and beyond anything we know. And then there's the other kind of holiness. And sometimes holiness appears as the illuminating good, replete and pleasurable. These two types of holiness, a holiness of otherness, awe, or even terror, encountering something we can't understand, something whose presence disturbs and overturns our world, and that holiness of comfort and presence that fills our life with a sense of wholeness. The Shabbat candles and the Hanukkah candles, as I said, each represent these two different types. And you can probably, it's not hard to kind of identify which one is which. The Shabbat candles represent the holiness of comfort and presence, because that's what their role is on Shabbat. That's what Shabbat is all about. We light the Shabbat candles because they serve a very practical purpose. They provide light for the home on Friday night for Shabbat dinner, right? In the words of the rabbis, when they talk about Shabbat candles, they say they're lit for Shalom Bayit, to create a sense of peace and harmony in the home. Because if the family was to eat in the dark on Friday night, right, all they would feel is a sense of distance from each other. They'd be alienated from each other. But the light of the Shabbat candles enables that Friday night meal to be as special as it is, right? It allows the family members to become close to one another. And ultimately, it's the Shabbat candles that allow the home to feel like a home, right? To feel like a place of warmth and comfort and connection. And I've never eaten a Friday night meal in the dark, but I, come close enough to it at times that I can imagine that it's not Shabbat dinner when you can't see each other, when you can't connect with each other, right? When you can't feel that presence and the holiness that comes about with that, right? The good food, the sense of, like I said, fullness and joy, right? Those are all part of what the Shabbat experience is supposed to be about. Rav Shagar goes on to say the Shabbat candles, they light up the home, the surroundings. The holiness here is familial. The light belongs to the home and is meant for the home. Like a good meal, overflowing with good and grace for the participants. The good and grace connect the participants to one another, right? That's the Shabbat candle experience. The Hanukkah candles are very different than Shabbat candles, even though they can look pretty similar, because their purpose isn't to bring light to the home. Ideally, the Hanukkah candles aren't even supposed to be lit in the home. They're supposed to be lit just outside the front door. In fact, the whole reason we light that extra Hanukkah candle, right, what we call the shamash, is specifically because we don't want to give the impression that we are benefiting from the light of the Hanukkah candles, right? So we add this extra little candle. So it's like if we somehow benefit from the light, we can say it's from the shamash, because we're not actually supposed to be benefiting from the Hanukkah candles. They're not there to bring light to the home. In fact, when we light the Hanukkah candles, we recite Hanerot Halalu, and as part of that tefillah, we say Ein lanu reshut lihishtamesh bahem ela lirotam bilvad. When we light the Hanukkah candles, we're saying we're not permitted to use the Hanukkah candles as a source of light, right? They're not there so that we have light in the home and we can read and we can be with our family on Hanukkah. That's not the purpose at all. We're not supposed to benefit from the Hanukkah candles. We light them outside the door, and that's where their light's going to be. But again, it's not for us to benefit. And in fact, once you light the Hanukkah candles, you can't move them, right? They're kadosh, right? They're holy and they're separate, and that's where they have to be. And Rav Shagar goes on to, again, clarify this kind of holiness. This is the holiness, again, not of comfort and closeness and connection, but the other kind, the scary kind. He says, can we identify these characteristics in the Hanukkah candle? And he cites that line I just said. We have no permission to use them, only to look at them. This light, the light of the candle, the Hanukkah candle, evokes the gap between it and the person who lights it. A person has no permission to use it, and as such, he must keep his distance from it, right? The Hanukkah candles, the light of the Hanukkah candles is a light of otherness, a light you can't touch. And where we light them, as I said, reveals a lot about the holiness they represent, because we light them just outside the door. And Rav Shagar goes on to explain. He says, moreover, the candle is located just outside the doorway of the home. And as God tells Cain, when he's concerned that Cain is jealous of his brother and that Cain might fall into sin, and of course we know this happens, but what God tells Cain, he says, sin crouches at the door, because the door is the gateway both in and out of the home, right? The home is where you're safe. The home is where you're comfortable. The home is where you are who you are, your identity. But once you go outside the home, you open yourself up to all sorts of dangerous and scary things. And by lighting the Hanukkah candles outside the home, Rav Shagar is saying is you are connecting to a holiness that is not the kind that you know and are comfortable with. It's like the holiness of Mount Sinai. It's that holiness which can be scary and overwhelming. And that's what Rav Shagar says. He says the candle, the Hanukkah candle, belongs not to the home and to that feeling of being at home, but also to an other space, a dark space outside that which we know, outside familiar boundaries, the demonic space, that's that dark space outside the home. Hanukkah candles are holy, but it's the kind of holy we experience when we are pushed to go beyond our comfort zone. It's a holiness we can't touch, and it's a holiness that we can never fully understand or have any kind of mastery over. And for Rav Shagar, both of these types of holiness, the Shabbat candles and the Hanukkah candles, for him become these models, these two different models of Achnasat Orchim, of hospitality. And they're really interesting, I think, the way that he contrasts the two together. And if we think about it, it's the hospitality, the Achnasat Orchim of the Shabbat candles we know really well, right? Because we've all experienced it. We've all experienced that kind of Achnasat Orchim, either as hosts or as guests. And to be honest, some of my most fond memories are Shabbat meals with my family growing up, or Shabbat meals with my family here in Israel, or meals in which I've been hosted by people, and I just felt something very special happen. And there's something about that Shabbat hospitality we all know that is very, very powerful and holy. So here's how Rav Shagar describes Shabbat hospitality. He says, Sabbath hosting, Shabbat hospitality, hosting guests develops out of a person being with himself, the solidarity of a person with himself and of the household with each other, which is Rav Shagar's way of saying that Shabbat is about feeling at home. It's about feeling comfortable with who you are and feeling connected to those who are with you in the home. He invites the other into his home, right? When we invite Shabbat guests into our home, we do it out of the expectation and belief, he says, that we have something in common with them, that we can connect with them. He says the solidarity, he invites the other into his home due to the fellowship and closeness that will exist and perhaps already exists between him and the household. The other, that guest, is invited to be a member of the household and to be able to take part as a son in the home, lit up by Shabbat candles and angels of peace. Ultimately, this mutual acceptance flows from the commonalities between people, and it reveals what they all share, the soul, which is a person's good intention. So I want to, again, just unpack what he means here. Rav Shagar often uses a little bit more poetic language, but he's saying something we all know, because if you've been at a Shabbat meal, you understand what he's talking about. For Rav Shagar, the holiness of Shabbat candles is an extension of the home. And as I said, for many, Shabbat is a special time of Achnasat Orchim, And it's the Shabbat candles that make this possible, because without light in a home, you can't bring people in and connect to them. Just as Shabbat candles draw together those who live in the home and enable the family to really feel like a family with deep and intimate connections, they can do the same for guests as well. The hospitality of Shabbat is the kind which turns a guest from a stranger into a member of the family, right? It brings out that connection, what everyone shares. And this is something, as I said, we probably all experienced before, because if you've ever been hosted at a large Shabbat meal with many strangers, you have this somewhat like magical experience, because despite the fact that nobody knows each other beforehand at the beginning of the meal, the guests quickly feel a sense of connection to their hosts and with each other. And where there was only distance before, now there's a sense of closeness. And this is made possible because homes have that ability to create a shared sense of commonality between the guests and those who dwell there. Even if it's just for a short period of time, the sense of bringing everybody together. This is made possible because, as I said, that's kind of what homes do. This is power of, I would say, any kind of kiruv that you find out there. That's why, Shabbat meals are always a key tool of kiruv, whether it's Chabad or any other kind of outreach, because they know that if they can get you into a Shabbat meal, they can give you a true taste of Shabbat. They can make you feel part of the experience, even if you're not religious, right? There's something about being at that Shabbat table where you just feel you're connecting to something greater in a sense that, again, brings so much joy and comfort and closeness and fullness. And there's countless people who became religious through a simple Shabbat meal, right? Feeling this sense of intimacy and closeness and holiness that Shabbat hospitality can bring about. Because ultimately the hospitality of Shabbat is the kind that says it's okay for me to invite you into my home because I know that you're like me, you're a Jew, and you'll experience the holiness of Shabbat and that you can find your space, your place here too. That's the hospitality of Shabbat. And I said it's a very special and warm and loving kind of hospitality. But again, Rav Shagar contrasts this with the hospitality of Hanukkah. And that, to a certain extent, is the one I'm a little bit more interested in because it's the more difficult kind. The hospitality of Hanukkah is different. One might even say it's radically different than the hospitality of Shabbat. It's about welcoming the other into our home, but with the expectation that they're not necessarily like you, or that they'll become like you over the course of a meal. The Hanukkah hospitality, Rav Shagar argues, space again for difference, even though it can be scary or threatening to us in every sense of self. It means bringing that other into my home who's so different from me without the expectation that by the end of the meal, so to speak, they're going to be just like me, which is our expectation on Shabbat. By the end of Shabbat dinner, we kind of expect everybody to feel connected and close. That's not the way Hanukkah hospitality works. And this is how Rav Shagar explains it. He says, hosting guests on Hanukkah is something else entirely because it requires self-sacrifice and inspires fear rather than the harmony of the Shabbat. This hosting guest does not deprive the other of his freedom and therefore does not expect solidarity and interpersonal closeness, but simply otherness. Meaning on Shabbat, there's an expectation when they come into your home, they're going to follow your rules, your norms. If they're a Jew, they're going to go wash their hands before Motzi. They're going to say Amen to the brachas, right? That's the expectation. They're coming in and they're kind of become like you. But that's not the way Hanukkah works. Because again, remember, Hanukkah candles, you don't get to benefit from them. You can't touch them. You just can kind of look at them from a distance, right? That means that when the guest comes into your home, they retain their freedom. They get to be who they are. They don't come in and suddenly start following your rules. And again, as Rav Shagar says here, there's no expectation of solidarity and interpersonal closeness, but simply otherness, often deep chasmal otherness between guest and host, right? The guest and the host don't end the meal feeling like they're one big family. This lets strangeness invade the home. And therefore, this hosting of guests destroys any feelings of at-homeness, of being at home, as the reality of the home loses its everyday familiarity. The candles are lit and shining, seemingly warm and familiar, but we do not have permission to use them, only to gaze at them. They estrange themselves from the person lighting them. So the hospitality of the Hanukkah candles is in many ways much harder than the hospitality that we achieve on Shabbat, because it's a hospitality that requires us to allow the other to remain other, to be different. We invite someone into our home and we want to have that magical feeling that by the end of the meal that we'll have this real connection with them, that we wouldn't mind having them back again. But in a sense, this expectation is somewhat problematic because we are always going to encounter people whose difference cannot be overcome so easily, that a Shabbat meal just can't suddenly make them like us or make us be able to connect with them. And there's always parts of people that we find scary and disturbing. And if we approach hospitality only with the mindset of Shabbat, that we can turn strangers into people just like us all the time, then we're going to find out very quickly that this is not always possible. And if you try to do Shabbat hospitality when it's not possible, instead of encountering holiness, you might actually end up doing violence. And that really brings us to a very interesting Talmudic story, which gets at these tensions, the difficulty of Shabbat hospitality versus Hanukkah hospitality. It's a story about a rabbi named Polimo. It's a story that demonstrates, as I said, the limits of hospitality, especially hospitality based on commonality and sameness and trying to make the other person just like us. And again, it shows one of my favorite Talmudic stories, and because it shows just how difficult it is to confront those who are different from us, those who are other than us, those who think differently, look at the world differently, act strangely, right? This story kind of brings to a head just how difficult that is. So the story opens as follows. Polima would say every day, an arrow in Satan's eyes. So what's going on here? So Polima, as I said, he's a rabbi, but it appears that he's also something of a self-righteous figure. He goes around every day saying an arrow in Satan's eye. And what this means is that Polimo thinks very highly of himself. He thinks he's the kind of person whom the Yetzer Hara cannot get the best of. In other words, he's someone he's a bit arrogant. He thinks he's a good person, and where other people may fall into sin, he will not. And as a result of this, the story is going to go on to tell us, Satan decides to test him, right? To kind of see if this guy, kind of bring him down a peg, right? Sort of show him he's not maybe as holy as he thinks he is. So what does Satan do? Well, one day, on eve of Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur, Satan disguises himself as a beggar, as a pauper, and comes knocking on the door. So what does Polimo do? He hears the door knocking. It's Erev Yom Kippur. He's inside eating with his family, right? This is presumably the Suda Mafseket, right? It's the last meal before Yom Kippur. It's the last meal before you go off to shul for Kol Nidre. So it's a special meal. It's not a Shabbat meal, but it's very similar in some ways, at least. So what does Polimo do when he hears someone knocking on his door? Well, to his credit, he does what a good person should do. He opens the door, and he sees a beggar standing outside, and Polimo decides to give him tzedakah, right? The story goes on. It says bread was brought out to him, the beggar, so that he would eat. But what's interesting here is he gives him tzedakah, the bread, but the expectation is the beggar is going to eat outside, right? Like, I give him enough so he's got what to eat, but Polimo doesn't really want to bring him inside. But Satan is very smart. Satan's always very smart. And he doesn't stop here. So what he does is, the story goes on, is he asks Polimo and the members of the household, he says as follows. He says, on such a day as today, one that is as special and as important as Yom Kippur, or Erev Yom Kippur, the entire world is inside, but I shall remain to eat alone outside. So what Satan is doing here is he's making very clear to Polimo that he wants to eat inside the home with Polimo and his family. He doesn't want tzedakah, right? He doesn't want tzedakah. He wants hachnasat orchim. He wants real hospitality. Even if they give him enough food to eat, right? That's not the same, right? They're eating what I said, what we call the Suda Mafseket, that last meal before Yom Kippur. It's a very special meal. In fact, the Gemara actually says that there were only 2 days of the year besides Shabbat and holidays when the Beit Midrash was empty. And those 2 days are Erev Pesach and Erev Yom Kippur. On Erev Pesach, everybody's home because it's obvious, right? There's so much preparations that have to be done. People need to be home. If a husband's not home Erev Pesach, if he's spending his time learning, he's not going to find himself married come after Pesach, right? He's got to be home to help out. A lot to be done. On Erev Yom Kippur, though, why do people need to be home, right? Erev Yom Kippur has some preparations, but not as much as Pesach. But what we do on Erev Yom Kippur is that we go around to the people that we know, the people that we care about and love, and we admit our wrongs and we ask for forgiveness. And one of the primary times you do that actually is that Sudam Afseket, that last meal before Yom Kippur. My parents are listening, and one of the minhagim that I grew up with that I'm always very appreciative of is that's what we would do right before Yom Kippur, is we go around and we would ask forgiveness from each other for the things that we did wrong. So when Polimo is asking to come inside the home to be with them during this meal, it's a very special time and an intimate moment to be with one's family, right? That's the time you want to be with the people that you love. And the beggar doesn't want to be alone, right? That makes sense. Everybody's with family right now. He wants to have that sense of connection too, or at least that's what Satan is playing up. So what does Polimo do? He agrees to invite the beggar inside. And the story goes on, and it says they brought him in and they set bread before him so that he could eat inside the house, but not at the table where they were all dining. So Polimo invites him in to eat, but he doesn't give them a seat at the family table. Now, as I said, it's kind of easy to maybe understand why Polimo does this. It's Erev Yom Kippur. He wants his family to have this intimate moment together, and all of a sudden a beggar shows up, a stranger, and demanding to be part of it all. And it's not just any stranger, but a beggar, someone whose strangeness can be quite off-putting. And we're going to see how that plays up here. But Satan doesn't stop. He doesn't want to eat at a separate table. He demands to come, further and further inside the home. And Satan says to them, on such a day as today, the entire world is at the table, but I'm alone. They brought him and they sat him at the table. So finally, he insists, and they say, okay, you know what? You can sit down and eat with us at our table, right? He wants to have that connection to them, like that sense of equality, right? They keep resisting, but finally they relent. But when he finally sits at the table, this is where we see how difficult hospitality really is. And why, like I said, sometimes we don't have the magic of the Shabbat candles to overcome the differences that exist between us and other people. Because what does the beggar do when he sits down with them? So the Gemara goes on to say, as he sat, he sort of moved his body around, he raised himself up, suppurating sores, and he engaged in repulsive behavior. He's literally popping the pus out of his sores at their dinner table on Erev Yom Kippur. And they say to him, they react pretty strongly. They say, sit properly, behave politely, and not in a manner that disgusts people, right? He's sitting at the table popping the pus out of his sores. You can imagine how any of us would react. So how does he respond? He says, give me a glass. And he takes the glass and he coughs and spits phlegm into the glass. And now you can imagine how they reacted, right? This is one of the more disgusting things you could envision at a meal with other people, for somebody to do something like this. They berate him for his behavior, and he falls dead. They think he's dead. He's not, but that's the impression that he gives. Now, remember I said hospitality that expects we can turn strangers into members of the family always has its limits. And we see those limits right here. The beggar acts in a repulsive manner. He's got these sores. He's squeezing the pus out of them at the dining room table. The family rebukes him, Polimo and them, and they can't handle how ugly and disgusting he is. But of course, it doesn't stop there. He takes the glass and he coughs up the phlegm right in front of them. And as I said, could there really be anything more disgusting than all this? Their family rebukes him again, and then he dies. And Satan's message to Polimo here seems to be kind of quite clear, right? You think you're so righteous? You think you're so inclusive? Nope. I'm sorry. You're intolerant of that which you find strange, different, ugly, disgusting. And your intolerance, it kills people, right? You murdered this guy, right? So after the guy appears to die, what does Polimo do, right? Polimo and the members of the family hear people shouting, Polimo has killed a man. Polimo has killed a man. And Polimo goes and hides. He leaves his home and he goes hides in the public bathrooms. Now, Polimo seemingly is hiding in shame, right? In the bathrooms, right? You want to kind of be away from everybody, and he's almost wallowing in his own misery. And it seems pretty clear he feels tremendous guilt for what's taken place, which I'll point out is a little strange, right? Would people really think Polimo invited a beggar into his home and killed him? Like, I don't think Polimo's a rabbi. I don't think people think he's a sociopath. And even if such a rumor had started, that people start screaming that he was a murderer, would it really be that hard to disprove? His entire family was there. They witnessed what took place. So what's going on here? Why is Polimo suddenly so embarrassed, so shamed, feeling so much guilt? So I think Polimo's guilt is at least in part because there's no small part of him that actually wanted the man dead, that actually wanted the beggar dead. Perhaps not consciously, but it's easy to understand why, right? That Erev Yom Kippur meal, that special Sudam Afseket, it's supposed to be this intimate moment, this holy moment for Polimo and his family. And instead, this disgusting stranger shows up and starts doing horrible things, who wouldn't want to see that man dead in those circumstances? Like we'd all kind of feel like that way. This guy's ruining my life, and it's disgusting and it's horrible. I just want him gone. While Polimo is sort of wallowing in his guilt and shame here, Satan finally reveals himself now fully to him, and shows that the beggar's not dead. And in fact, he shows Polimo who he really is, that it was all kind of a setup, that it was all kind of a test for Polimo. And Satan goes on to say, he says to Polimo, he reveals himself, and Satan asks him, why did you go around telling people an arrow in Satan's eyes, right? You shouldn't do that, right? You shouldn't be self-righteous like that. And Polimo responds to Satan that, how should I speak? And Satan says to him, my Lord should say, may the merciful one rebuke Satan, right? Don't think you're better than Satan, right? That's putting yourself in this arrogant position. Say God should deal with Satan, right? Because God can do it. That's, all of us are ultimately, going to succumb to the Yetzer Hara. Don't put yourself above it, right? And Satan's point here basically seems to be to Polimo, don't think you're so righteous. Don't think you're so inclusive and amazing and wonderful, and you can open you're good to everybody, and there's nothing wrong with you. Because when push comes to shove and you're faced with something that you truly find disturbing, you're going to be as horrible as everybody else out there that you don't like. And I think that's what we really learn from the story here. We learn how hard, how difficult Hachnasat Orchim really is. As I said, this is not a story of encountering a stranger, but inviting them home for a meal and discovering how wonderful they are. This is a story that shows the limits of hospitality, how profoundly difficult and challenging it is to invite someone into your home when they're so different from you, when they appear even monstrous to you. In those situations, all we want to do is get rid of them. All we want to do is for them to leave, and we'll push them away. And like Polimo, well, probably part of us will kind of just want them to die, just like, ugh. The hospitality of Shabbat doesn't work in these situations. There's no commonality to be created between host and guest. And these situations really represent, as I said, not the hospitality of Shabbat, but the hospitality of Hanukkah, the Hanukkah candles. A hospitality where we have to make a space for difference, for otherness, and know that like the Hanukkah candles, we can't touch the other. We can't bridge that gap between us and them sometimes. And that's important if we really want to make a space for people and be truly, ethical in that way. And to do so, again, is to experience holiness. Because again, holiness is not always all the good things. Sometimes holiness means confronting the parts of us and others that we find scary and terrible. Because again, if holiness is only about the things you like, then as I've said before in these shiurim, it's not really holiness. It's just, you're making idols in your own image. Now, what I love about this story is that Polimo isn't so much of an exceptional character. It's easy to see ourselves in Polimo's shoes. We're all Polimo in a sense. We all like to think of ourselves as good people, that we'll do the right thing in the right situation, that we do good deeds, give tzedakah, and even we'll do hospitality. But at some point, encounter an other who we find strange or even repulsive. Maybe it's their beliefs, maybe it's their politics, maybe it's their religious behavior, and all we want to do is for them to go away. To keep them as far as possible from our homes. So just to conclude this whole piece of it, I want to turn to what I see as ultimately a successful example of hospitality. This is a failure ultimately, because it shows that limits of trying to, again, make the other like us and assuming that can always happen. The kind of hospitality we have to aspire to at times is like the Hanukkah candles, that one that makes a space for difference. Sometimes it's referred to in post-structuralist thought, radical hospitality. It's an idea that was very much popularized by Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida, and it's influencing Rav Shagar here. That again, that hospitality that makes a space for otherness. And the real example of the Hanukkah hospitality, the radical hospitality, we find in Avraham and Sarah. And again, it's the example that we know, but it's worthwhile to pay closer attention to it because there are some subtle things taking place in it that are really significant for what does it mean to engage in hospitality with those who are really different from us, who we don't necessarily like, whose presence we don't necessarily enjoy. So the kind of hospitality demonstrated by Avram and Sarah, as I said, the kind of hospitality that makes a space for the other. And what's fascinating, I think, from a Jewish perspective, is that this model of hospitality is so important because it represents the heart of the Brit, the covenant God makes with Abraham, right? literally right before Avraham welcomes in the guests, the three travelers, that's when he does Brit Milah. That's when he gets the mitzvah of Brit Milah. And if the very next event that occurs is this moment of hospitality, then that tells you that the Brit, the covenant between God and the Jewish people, is very much wrapped up in this idea of hospitality, of opening one's home to another. And you could, in fact, argue that it's Abraham's willingness to engage in true hospitality, radical hospitality, that makes him chosen by God in the first place, that Abraham can make a space for the other as other. And he demonstrates this, as I said, through the hospitality he shows to those three strangers traveling through the desert. So what does Avram and Sarah's hospitality look like in practice? Well, in many ways, it's the opposite of polimo. Their tent is open, right? In the Torah, it's at least open by the front. The Midrash says that it's open in all four directions, right? If you remember, Polimo's door was closed, right? The beggar had to knock on it. Avram's tent is open. And the reason that's significant is because it signals to travelers that his home is a place where potentially one could stay. And as we see in the pasuk here, in the first verse, it says God appears to Abraham. Abraham is sitting at the entrance of the tent in the middle of the day as it grows hot. Right, he's sitting at the entrance of the tent, which is open, because he's got his eyes out for travelers. He wants to be able to show them hospitality, even though it's really hot. And I can tell you, it's like 95 degrees in Jerusalem today. It can be really hot. And the middle of the day is the hottest part of the day. But there's Abraham by the door, looking for people to host. And the appearance of these travelers is an interruption to his life, right? We see in a moment here, he's going to go through all these different steps to help them. All right. So when the guests come, strangers come, it's not just he can take care of this in a few minutes. Their appearance is a major interruption, but nevertheless, Avraham responds immediately. And unlike Polimo, has to be pushed. Tzedakah, let me inside, let me come to your table. Right. He has to be pushed to engage in hospitality. Avraham, jumps to it, right away. And perhaps what's most significant is that the people Avraham shows hospitality to are very different from him in two significant ways. But you remember that beggar was so hard for Polimo because he was disgusting. And who wants to bring a disgusting person into their home? So in a sense, these three travelers are not people that would be easy for Avraham to bring into his home. So first off, they don't share his religion and worldview, right? Avraham has this unique covenant with God that separates him out from everybody else in Eretz Canaan, right, in the land of Israel. These people are going to be idol worshipers, and he's not. Avram has this unique covenant with God, and they're not part of it. And in fact, one could even see these people as Avram's enemies. God's promised the land to Avram's descendants. And the only way for that to be possible is if the people who live in the land right now ultimately become dispossessed. So these travelers who are traveling the land of Israel, Avram would have a good argument not to want to show any hospitality to them whatsoever, right? That's point one, right? They're different. They're idol worshipers. They're maybe his enemies. That's a big problem. And the second issue, which is also just important to keep in mind, is that Avram's not from the land of Israel. Avram's from Aram Naharaim. He's from the east, from Babylonia. He's a stranger in the land of Israel, which means he doesn't have a whole lot in common with these people. It's not like if this story was taking place in Babylonia, he at least knows the culture. He grew up in that religion. Like, he has some sense of connection to them. And in Israel, he is a stranger. And later on in the Torah, he says, Ger v'toshav anochi. I'm a stranger here in the land of Israel. I don't really know anybody. They look at me skeptically, cynically, and I don't really have a connection to them. This kind of hospitality is not like the shul calling you up on Erev Shabbat and telling you there's a family in town that needs a Shabbat meal. Right? This kind of hospitality is the random stranger walking down your street in Beechwood or wherever who is not like you in any way, probably not Jewish, and nevertheless you invite them into your home. Avram never asks for their names. There's no establishment of any kind of social hierarchy or assignment of any kind of social identity, because the first thing we do when you invite somebody in your home is to ask, what's your name? Where are you from? Because your goal is to try to establish some sense of commonality or connection with them. That's not what Avram does. Like I said, he lets them be their strangeness and their otherness. Avram acts with Mesiras Nefesh, a sense of sacrifice, and even compulsion to the guests, or he's doing everything for them. He runs out to them. He gets them the best food. He's doing it quickly. He wants them to feel comfortable in his home without imposing his rules and norms upon them. In fact, Avram's actions are so radical here that the Midrash actually tries to tone them down quite a bit. One of the verses, it says that Avram offers to wash their feet. And the Midrash explains that Avram's not doing this because he wants to make them feel comfortable after traveling. He actually has ulterior motives, the Midrash says. He knows these travelers are idol worshipers, and some idol worshipers worship the earth and the very dust on their feet. So Avram wants to wash their feet so he can wash off their avodah zarah. He can wash off the dirt of idolatry that's on their feet so they don't bring it into his home, which is very interesting because basically what the Midrash is saying is that Avram's kind of like Polimo here. He'll let the other in, but only on his terms. That's what the Midrash is getting at. Only if they remove the parts of themselves that make them strange and different to Avram. But that's the Midrash. The Torah is pretty clear. He's just doing this all for them, no matter what. In my opinion, the most radical detail of the whole story that makes this such a powerful example of hospitality, like Rav Shagar said, that Hanukkah candles, that holiness of otherness, is towards the end. As we saw with Polimo, what makes radical hospitality so challenging is at some point you encounter a strangeness, an otherness that can't be bridged, right? That moment where the beggar is so repulsive, Polimo and his whole family are just disgusted by it. They want him out. And when you experience that, it just shocks you. And it's usually at this point that we push the other away. We just try to get rid of them. We want them out of our home. But the story of Avram and Sarah shows how we can overcome this gap, or at least acknowledge the gap in a way that allows us to engage in hospitality. The strangers tell Avram that he and Sarah are going to have a child despite their advanced age. And when Sarah hears this, what does she do? Right, she has a famous moment here. She laughs. So what's interesting is what exactly is the meaning of this laugh that she does here? What she finds so funny, and what does it have to teach us about hospitality? Because it actually teaches us something important. Now, if you look at the verse here, verse 11, let me skip ahead to verse 11. It says, now Avram and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women. She was postmenopausal. She wasn't somebody who could have kids. And as it says in verse 12, Sarah laughed to herself, saying, now that I'm withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old? Right? Sarah hears the news that Abraham will get her pregnant, and she finds it absurd. She's a very old woman at this point, and such a thing is simply impossible. Why would these strangers say something so absurd, so stupid? Now, we know just before this whole episode that when God gives Abraham the mitzvah Brit Milah, he tells Abraham that they're going to have a son. And Abraham laughs when he hears this from God. But the commentators all note that his laughter is different from Sarah's. When he hears the news, he hears it from God directly. His laughter is a laughter of joy and of wonder. Sarah hears the news from the strangers, and she doesn't know what to do with it. And she finds it absurd. She doesn't know these are divine guests. She thinks these are strangers from who knows where, who are different, and as I said, weird. And when she hears this news, she cannot help but laugh. Now, what's fascinating is what comes next in the narrative, because God confronts Abraham and basically tells him Sarah just laughed when she heard the news. And God tells Abraham, basically implying, why should she laugh? I'm God. I can do anything, right? You think I can't make a miracle such that you can have a child even at this advanced age? And what's interesting is that when God says this, Sarah hears God speaking to Abraham. She's a little concerned by this because it's sort of like she just got called out by God for, acting inappropriately. So again, what's going on here? So I think we have to recognize that her laugh when she hears the news is a response to the absurdity of these strangers in front of her. And it's an acknowledgement of the gap between her and them that cannot be bridged, but still needs to be recognized. It's this laugh, which I think actually makes it an act of radical hospitality. Because if Sarah was doing the hospitality of Shabbat candles, she would have only viewed the strangers through her own values and worldview. She'd think they're crazy, probably. And she would ignore what they said as foolishness. You invite a stranger into your home who you don't know, and sometimes they say crazy things. You kind of smile and you try to change the subject as quickly as possible. But the reason Sarah laughs is because she opens herself up to their strangeness, to their weirdness, and to their difference. She's really there with them, like with who they are. She's not just being like, yeah, whatever, let's help you and get you out of here. And when you encounter something that's truly weird and strange and different, something truly shocking, perhaps the most ethical thing you can do is laugh. We find things funny because they often represent contradictions, because they represent absurdities, two things that don't go together, right? In this case, it's this news that she's going to have a child. It's not possible. But she takes it so seriously, she kind of can't help but laugh, right? There's a famous Saturday Night Live actor, Chris Farley, does a lot of physical comedy, unfortunately died young. And he has this bit in one of his movies, very, very heavy guy. But he could like move around real quickly. And he has this bit where he would go around like wearing this like very tight clothing, saying fat man in a little suit. Because it's absurd to see an extremely overweight man wearing very, very tight clothing, right? It's funny, it's bizarre. And that's essentially to acknowledge that. That's what Sarah's doing here. When she encounters the otherness, the strangeness of the strangers, she could have ignored it. She could have screamed at them, get out of her home, right? What are you crazy people doing here? But instead she laughs. And I think that, like I said, that laugh is very significant because it's actually making a space for the otherness, because sometimes that's all you can do is laugh to acknowledge it. And I think there's something very ethical about that, because the alternative often means just trying to get rid of it entirely, like Polimo did, right? When Polimo saw that beggar acting disgusting, it would have been better to laugh, not to make fun of the beggar, but as a way of acknowledging the irony and absurdity of it, as opposed to, again, to rebuke and to just try to get rid of them. So as I said, God catches Sarah laughing, and she tells Avraham. And when Sarah picks up on this, she actually denies that she laughs. It says here in verse 15, Sarah lied, saying, immediately I did not laugh, for she was frightened. Right? She feels like she was sort of caught in the act, and she denies that she laughed. But then God continues and he says, no, you laughed, Sarah, you did laugh. Now, one could read this as a rebuke of Sarah, that God's making clear to her that she did something wrong and she must own up to it, don't deny it. But there is another way of reading God's words. God doesn't want her to deny that she has laughed. Her laughter is important. And as I said, it serves an ethical function. It's her way of acknowledging the strangeness of the strangers, their words, the absurdity of it all, without ignoring them and or without throwing them out of her home. And sometimes, as I said, the only way radical hospitality is truly possible is to acknowledge how impossible it really is. What Polimo should have done when he welcomed the beggar into his home is not take himself too seriously. It's what we all kind of have to do when we're faced with an other whose differences make us uneasy or get under our skin. And part of the way we try not to take ourselves too seriously is by laughing, and again, at the absurdities that we experience. And in this story, as with Polimo, the divine appears, right? Satan was God, and he appeared, and so too the angels appear, but they appear not as something comforting and comprehensible, but as a stranger, a beggar, a disgusting other, travelers who may in fact be idol worshipers who spout nonsense that an elderly woman would have a child. And in both of these stories, the stranger, the foreigner, is the one who turns out to be divine. Right? That's the message here. The stranger, the different one, the one who scares us, is actually, godly. This is a powerful lesson for what it means to encounter holiness, especially that holiness of the Hanukkah candles, because true holiness, the kind we experience when we encounter a divine or a human other, often exceeds our grasp, and it challenges us far more than it comforts us. Learning to make a space for that kind of holiness is perhaps the greatest ethical task that we have as Jews and human beings, and it's obviously not easy. I want to make one more final point in connection to Tisha B'Av. And as I said before, what makes Avram's hospitality radical is his ability to make a space for the other as other. And we see it not only here with the welcoming of the guests, but also what happens right afterwards. After the guests leave, God tells Avraham he'll destroy Sodom because of its wickedness. Now we know that the famous part of the narrative is Avraham goes on to argue with God that he shouldn't destroy Sodom. And he demands to God that if there are at least 10 righteous people in the city, it should be saved. But this is actually a really strange move on Avraham's part to argue with God as he does. Because why is Avraham arguing to save Sodom? Sodom is evil. They're wicked. When Avraham hears God will destroy them, what we expect him to do is to celebrate. That's what we would all do. It would be the equivalent of someone telling you during World War II that Nazi Germany is going to be destroyed. right? If Avraham was to argue with God at all, it shouldn't be to save the wicked people of Sodom. It should be only to save the righteous people. But that's not what Avraham does. He argues with God to save the wicked, right? If there's at least 10 righteous, save everybody, save the wicked. Because Avram's hospitality expands beyond the walls of his tent. He is willing to make a space for the other, even when who they are offends everything that he stands for. He doesn't want them to be wiped off the face of the earth. Right? That is hospitality in a sense that's hard for any of us to grasp, but that's what makes Avraham. That's why he's chosen to found the covenant, the Brit. And on some level, that means is at the heart of what the Brit is all about for us. So how is this connected to Tisha B'Av? So in the Haftarah, we're going to read this Shabbat. It's from Yeshayahu, the first parak of Yeshayahu, Chazon Yeshayahu it's called. And in that parak, the prophet describes Jerusalem as Sodom. And like Sodom, the message is it's going to be destroyed. Right? The verse here, Shimu Devar Hashem, Kitzine Sodom, Ha'azinu, Torat Eloheinu, Am Amorah. Hear the word of Lord, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to our God's instruction, you folk of Gomorrah. Right? Jerusalem is like Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Which means it's evil, it's wicked, it deserves to be destroyed. And what's interesting is you have to keep in mind what exactly was the sin of Sodom. Well, there are many sins, but the most prominent among them in the Torah is that Sodom fails at Hachnasat Orchim, hospitality. Sodom could not make a place for the other who was different at all. And we see this later on in Parshat Vayera, after Abraham welcomes in the guests, the angels, they go to Sodom, they meet Lot. Lot welcomes the angels into his home, and then all the people of Sodom, all the men of Sodom gather up around Lot's house and demand Lot send the visitors, the strangers out of the home so that they can abuse them. Because Sodom doesn't want anybody who's from there coming there, right? Get that other out of there. And this tells us a lot, because if Sodom was destroyed because of a failure of hospitality, then on some level Jerusalem is being destroyed for a failure of hospitality. And so to the opposite, Jerusalem can be rebuilt through radical hospitality, that hospitality of the Hanukkah candles. We started our shiurim 3 weeks ago with this very point. As Rav Kook said, the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred, and will be rebuilt with ahavat chinam, unconditional love, which first and foremost means making a space in our homes, our literal and metaphorical homes, for those who are different from us, and finding a way to live with them. And this is central, again, to our vision of a rebuilt temple and a rebuilt Yerushalayim. Later on in Yeshayahu, towards the end of the book, there's a famous verse which kind of captures this. And we say it as part of Slichot and Tefillot, so it's a familiar one, but it's worth repeating. V'haviotim el har kodshi v'simachtim b'veit tefilati olotehem v'zivchehem l'ratzon ha'mizbechi ki veiti beit tefillah yikarei l'chol ha'amim. I will bring them to my sacred mount, not just the Jewish people here, but everyone, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer, right? Beiti, right? God's home is the Beis HaMikdash. That's the home of God. And the whole idea here is that the home of God will be a home in which all people can find their place, Jews and non-Jews. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. For my house, my home, God's home, right? The home of the Jewish people, but the home of all humanity, shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. What's God's home? As I said, it's the Beit HaMikdash. And it's a home that's not just for the Jews, but a home that makes a space for all peoples, for all others, and in their otherness. That's the kind of home that we're aspiring to build for ourselves, for the Jewish people, and ultimately for the world. And like any efforts we have to better the world, it begins with one small act of love at a time. And it's not easy, because again, real love, as I said, requires loving those who are different from us, preserving that difference and making a space for them in the most intimate parts of our lives. But it's that kind of love which is ultimately redemptive.